The idea of republicanism was the first great contribution of the Romans to the history of law and justice. Let's turn now to the Roman constitution, the way the Romans organized power in the period of the Republic. This is the second great contribution of the Romans to the history of politics. The Roman constitution during the Republic has been one of the most influential political experiments in all of human history. And to understand the Roman constitution in this period, there's no better guide for us than a Greek observer named Polybius. Polybius was brought to Rome in the aftermath of the Roman conquest of Greece. We turn now to the 2nd century BC. And as we'll see in future lectures, this is the period when the Roman Republic expands and becomes an empire, when it comes to dominate the Mediterranean world, as no power before it had. And Polybius is a first-hand observer, indeed, a witness to the rise of Roman dominance. And Polybius poses in his great work, the Histories, the question, why did the Romans rise to dominance? What was it that made the Romans the dominant power of the Mediterranean? And his answer was the Roman constitution, the Republican constitution itself. Polybius would ascribe the greatness of Rome, the success of Rome as an imperial power, to her constitutional form. Indeed, there's no other obvious explanation for the success of the Romans. There's no obvious reason why this city, inland on the Tiber River, would come to dominate the Mediterranean. The Italians have not dominated the Mediterranean before or since. And Polybius says it has to do with the political structure and the political culture of the Roman Republic itself. Polybius is a Greek. He's brought to Rome, in fact, in the aftermath of the Roman conquest of Greece. The Romans conquered the Greeks in the first half of the 2nd century BC. And in particular, after a decisive victory in the year 168 at the Battle of Pydna, a number of Greek aristocrats are brought as hostages, in effect as political prisoners, to the city of Rome, where they live under house arrest to ensure that the Greeks won't revolt against the Roman governors in this territory. And Polybius is brought to the city of Rome itself, and he's placed within the house of one of the great Roman noble families, a great military family. And so Polybius is brought to Rome under rather peculiar conditions, rather comfortable conditions. And during his time in Rome, he would come to greatly admire Roman culture and the Roman families that he would know in particular. Polybius was clearly educated in the Greek philosophical tradition. He had read Plato, he had read Aristotle. And as you read Polybius's account of the Roman constitution, understand that you're reading it through the eyes of a Greek, that you're seeing the Roman constitution in Greek terms. Polybius describes the Roman constitution in terms that would have been familiar to Aristotle. And in particular, Polybius believes that the Roman constitution was a mixed constitution. He believes that there are 3 different forms of constitution, just like Aristotle had articulated in his Politics. There are rule by the one, rule by the many, and rule by the few. And there are correct and deviant forms of each of these. And Polybius clearly believes that there's a certain cycle, that political power begins as monarchy, but that monarchy corrupts into tyranny. And tyranny is overthrown by an elite group who establishes power, an aristocracy. This aristocracy will at first rule well, but will eventually corrupt and turn into an oligarchy, a narrow elite that rules for its own interests and oppresses the poor. This oligarchy will then be overthrown in a democratic revolution that will set up the rule by the many. And for a time this will be just, but inevitably the many will become a mob, and democracy will descend into the mob rule, until it then is overthrown by a virtuous ruler who will again establish monarchy, beginning the cycle over again. Polybius believes that the Romans have somehow escaped, or at least slowed, this cycle of decadence by establishing a mixed constitution. And Polybius sees the genius of the Roman Republican constitution in its mixed character. And this is a tremendously influential idea. The idea that a constitution can have a mixed form, that it can embody monarchical, aristocratic, and popular elements. And indeed, this is a fair description of the Roman Republican constitution. When the Romans overthrow their kings in 509 BC, they establish a republic under the first consuls, Brutus and his colleague Publicola. The consuls would remain the primary magistrate throughout the rest of Roman history. And the Roman constitution is so organized that there are a series of executives, elected officers who hold executive power. Most importantly, the consuls themselves, always remaining 2 in number, always alternating power, holding the highest kind of power in the Roman system, a power that's called imperium, where we get our word empire. It's an absolute power, the power to command, the power to punish. It's the absolute kind of power that's wielded by a military commander over those who are in his command. Imperium is symbolized by the possession of the fasces, a bundle of rods that are carried by an attendant called a lictor. And this is where our word fascism comes from, this kind of absolute raw power. The consuls are, in fact, military commanders. They're commanders-in-chief, much like our own president has the primary duty as commander-in-chief. The Roman chief executives, the consuls, are, above all, military generals. And it's important to think of the Roman magistrates in those terms, as military officers, elected 2 per year. The Roman constitution has a number of other executive offices. Beneath the consuls are a number of officers called praetors. They have, as well, a kind of imperium, a strong kind of executive authority. They also will come to gain a kind of legal authority. The Roman magistrates continue, quaestors, aediles, a whole range of offices that are elected, in many cases annually, to hold the highest kinds of executive power in the Roman system. And for the analysis of Polybius, this is a kind of monarchical power. But it's the genius of the Roman system that this power is administered by the people themselves through the election of these officers. The Roman constitution also includes, Polybius says, an aristocratic element. That is an element of rule by the best. And remember that for Aristotle, an aristocracy is rule by those who are most virtuous, those who are most worthy. It's not necessarily a landed or an inherited aristocracy. It is a rule by those who are truly the best. And for the Romans, the best are the senators. The aristocratic organ of the Roman constitution is the Senate. The Senate, the Romans believed, was even older than the Republic itself. A senatus is literally a body of gray-haired old men, a group of experienced men. For to be in the Roman Senate, you had to have held high office in the Roman state. You had to have military experience. To be a Roman senator also meant that you had to be a member of the Roman elite orders. You had to be a patrician to be in the Roman Senate in the Republic. The Senate is a body of experienced men who've held military command and who come from the elite and, above all, the wealthy ranks of Roman society. In some sense, the Senate is the dominant institution of the Roman Republic. The Senate is where the power lies during the Republican period. And although the Roman Republican constitution is a mixed constitution, the Senate is undoubtedly its dominant organ. The Senate actually has what we would consider to be relatively limited legal powers. The Senate can't pass laws. The Senate can't command armies in battle. The Senate plays a largely advisory role to the Roman magistrates. The Senate has relatively limited, seemingly limited legal powers. Nevertheless, it had authority. It had auctoritas in Latin. It had the respect of the magistrates, and it guided the ship of state throughout the Roman Republic. And the Senate we should consider to be the heart of the Roman Republican Constitution. And the Roman Republican Constitution has a popular element. It has a monarchical, an aristocratic, and a popular element. And the popular element is institutionalized in the form of a number of assemblies, the most important of which is the Comitia Centuriata, the Roman Committee of the Centuries. It is a military assembly, and we can think of the Comitia Centuriata as the Roman people in their form as an army electing their magistrates. The assemblies broadly have 2 kinds of powers. They have legislative powers. They can make what is a lex, a law, and they elect the magistrates. The people of Rome elect the magistrates of Rome. At the same time, there are limits to Roman democracy. Even the assemblies are not organized on the principle of one man, one vote. They are organized in such a way that people who have greater property have disproportionate weight in the voting schema. In fact, they're also organized so that people who are older, people of a greater age, have a disproportionate weight in the voting system. So the Roman democratic element is not pure democracy. It's certainly not participatory democracy, like classical Athens, and it's certainly not what we would consider truly democratic. It is limited only to males, only to citizens, and it's heavily weighted towards those who are older and those who hold property. Nevertheless, there's truly a popular element in Roman politics that runs across the Republican period. And so Polybius is right to describe the Republican constitution as a mixed constitution that achieves a kind of balance between the monarchical, the aristocratic, and the popular elements. And Polybius sees this as the genius of the Roman constitution and sees it as the secret to the success of the Roman people.